Hey, this is Dr. Allen. We're going to talk about nervous tissue now. So when we're looking at nervous tissue, I'd like for you to think about it in a few different categories. So one way is that, are we talking about neurons, which are those nerve cells themselves, and kind of pictured here, here's a neuron, or is it the support cells in the support structure called neuroglia? Another way to think about it is whether the nervous tissue is in the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. Central meaning the brain and spinal cord, and then peripheral means elsewhere in the body, the nerves that go out to your, say, your arms and your legs. So then as we're looking at the motor neuron itself, okay, this is kind of the classic nerve cell that people think about, where you have, it's almost alien looking, right? But you have this cell body, which is this main structure here. Within that cell body, you can see the nucleus and the nucleolus. Coming off the cell body are these little extension things, almost looks like lightning, right? And these are dendrites, these little things here, and they make the connections to other nerve cells as well. And then along the longer part of this neuron is called an axon. That's the really long thing that extends out. Could be very, very long or very, very short, depending on the nerve cell, where it's located and what it does. On the axon itself, these little cushiony-like things here is called myelin. Made by Schwann cells. We'll talk about that here in a few slides. But essentially, with your motor neuron, that's your classic nerve cell, an impulse will travel from, say, here in the cell body, along this axon, and come out here, and maybe it'll terminate either on a muscle, right, because it's a motor neuron. It'll cause the muscle to contract. Other types of nerve cells will connect to other neurons, it'll connect to glands or some other things. We'll get into that when we actually get into the nervous system. For now, I want you to recognize this general shape and structure of a basic motor neuron. Now, with that said, I'd like to call your attention to this right here. Before I had said things like a myocyte is a muscle cell, and I often use this site as part of this thing. Well, for neurons, we don't use the word neurocyte. It's more of a, you would just use the word neuron. So neuron basically is nerve cell. That's the convention that we use. Okay, so when we're looking at neurons, we can classify them in three different ways based on their shape. 99% of neurons in the body have this particular shape right here, right? It's called multipolar. Where you have the cell body, you have all these little dendrites here kind of coming off. Those are that's the multipolar nature of it, because it can connect to other neurons in this process, like connections in the brain, for example. It'll have this axon that comes along and this little termination right here that might go to another cell body through their dendrites, or it could, again, attach to a muscle and tell the muscle to contract or stuff like that. We'll worry about that at the nervous system unit. So that's multipolar. Then you can have unipolar, right? Means it's just goes in one direction. So you have a cell body here. You just basically have a long axon, and then you have the receptors over here, and then it kind of comes over here and sends the signal. So these are like sensory neurons. So like in your skin, the sensation of touch will be picked up by this unipolar neuron and bring that sensation back to the central nervous system through various tracts. And then finally, we have this one here called a bipolar neuron. This is relatively rare in your body. It's basically either in your eye for your retina or in your nose. That's the olfactory, which is the sense of smell. So it's very similar to this unipolar, but it's just kind of more of just a single flow of issue from the dendrite to the cell body to the axon. All right, so now we're going to talk about neuroglia, the support cells. And the first batch of neuroglia we're going to talk about are in the central nervous system. So astrocytes are the first type, astrocytes. This is the astrocyte. Astro, um, I believe it means star, right? So an astrocyte looks like a star. And so it's a cell, has the nucleus here, and then these little projections here come out here. This is back here a neuron in the background, right? Maybe this is a dendrite, or maybe it's a axon. Doesn't really matter for this discussion. And then you have these capillaries, which are the blood vessels that bring oxygen and nutrients to your brain. So these astrocytes will support, anchor, and brace the neurons, keep them in place. They'll act as some sort of connector, if you will, to these capillaries. You see how it kind of cover the walls of the capillaries. And what that does is it creates something called the blood-brain barrier. And what that means is that the astrocytes will help reduce the flow of substances out of the blood and into the brain. It's very selective. It's a protective mechanism to keep the brain from being exposed to toxins or other bad things. It could also act as a barrier to give therapeutics. For example, certain medications won't work in the brain because it can't pass this blood-brain barrier. Anyway, the idea here is the astrocytes and what they do. I'd like you to know this. Next, microglial cells. They monitor the health of the neuron. So this is a neuron here. This microglial cell here is like this. What it does, it's kind of like an immune system. It's a defensive function. So if there's some bacteria here in the brain, it'll convert into a macrophage, which will then eat up the bacteria. Or if a neuron is damaged and there's fragments of debris, it'll go through and it'll phagocytize the debris. Okay, so it's a defensive mechanism within the brain, within the central nervous system. Next up are ependymal cells. You can kind of see here. They line cavities within the central nervous system. And these cavities will have a special fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid tends to flow and circulate through the brain and spinal cord, helps provide nutrients, helps to support the nervous tissue. But these ependymal cells here, you can kind of see this shape. They're a little bit kind of cuboid shape. They've got these cilia here on one end, and then it kind of also acts as a bit of a barrier to the nervous tissue underneath. Oligodendrocytes. Remember the dendrite on that motor neuron, those little projections that kind of come out. Well, oligodendrocytes are these cells here which have a few projections that go out and they produce this substance called myelin. And this is specifically in the central nervous system. So you have this axon that comes along right here. Remember, that's that long process. On the axons will be this myelin substance. The myelin is produced in the central nervous system, say for example the brain, will produce some myelin, and that helps with the transmission of the nerve signals as it goes along the axon. And then in the peripheral nervous system, there's just a couple of cells to point out. There could be called Schwann cells, or if you speak Germanic languages, Schwann. And then you could have satellite cells. And these are the peripheral nervous system. So that's outside of the brain and spinal cord. So the satellite cells will serve as protection against, they'll protect the cell body, is one thing they do. And then the Schwann cells, they will produce myelin, but this is in the peripheral nervous system. So those long nerves that maybe go down to your feet, and you have to have this myelin here to help with the transmission of the nerve impulse. So they'll have Schwann cells produce this myelin, as opposed to the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. And now a little bit about myelin. So this is in the peripheral nervous system here, but myelin also exists in the central nervous system. So if this yellow rod here is the axon of a neuron, you'd have this Schwann cell and it goes around and kind of wraps around this. You see how it makes this nice spirally kind of shape here, and that creates this myelin, which serves as a bit of kind of like insulin. So it's like an insulation layer on a wire, as an example. Well, what happens with myelin is that it helps to speed up nerve transmissions along the length of an axon. We'll get into that more in the, like I said before, the central nervous system portion and the peripheral nervous system later on in this course. But right now, I just want you to be able to recognize myelin as this protective layer, and I want you to know that the different cells that produce myelin are the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system and the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. All right, so that concludes our nervous tissue lesson. We'll see you for the next one.